Hi, everyone. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And I'm Dr. Hinson.
And we're here with a hot-ish take.
Yes. It's still hot, I think.
Still warm. A warm take.
A warmish take.
On Hannah Gadsby's singular piece of brilliance entitled Nanette. Now, there's been lots of chatter about this, lots of media outlets. I first encountered this work actually when she was still working it out at the Edinburgh Fringe. So I've known about it kind of in the ether for a little while, but I will admit to watching it entirely because Linda Holmes from NPR ordered all of her Twitter followers to do so.
Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Linda.
Because then she shared the link with a group chat of ours, and then another friend watched it and posted about it, and that's how I watched it. So,
and it's one of those where this is a little bit like Hamilton in that it lives up to the hype. You may think that people are talking about it too much, and my answer is going to be we have not even begun to talk about it.
No.
Not because Hannah herself is so powerful, which she is, but because the themes that she begins to unpack is the beginning of a conversation about the social responsibility of comedy that I don't think anyone else has ever tried to
do. No. And just like Hamilton, my immediate reaction to seeing Hamilton was, were I infinitely wealthy, I would pay for everyone to see it. Because I think it is one of those things that you are responsible for knowing and for engaging with, particularly as an art form or a piece of art. And it is the same for this. My feeling after watching this was everyone should watch it. Everyone should be required to watch it. We should show it in sex ed classes. We should show it in identity classes, in gender studies classes, as many times as possible, multiple times. Sit down with your family. Watch it. Yeah.
I mean, I know that sounds hyperbolic, and we are at times lent to hyperbole.
Sometimes.
But I will say, that's what I'll say.
Yeah.
I really would. So what we'd like to particularly unpack, because we're not going to try to retell Hannah's story because Hannah's story is Hannah's story, and we'd like to encourage you to interact with the art that she created on her terms. But what we would like to talk about is our interaction with about 3 or 4 of her main points.
Yes.
And so first of all, for anyone who's watching this who hasn't seen Nanette, essentially what Hannah is doing is talking about herself. She is she identifies as a lesbian, although she then goes on to say she identifies as tired, which I 100%.
My primary identity is tired.
It's tired, which is my primary identity as well. But she would be a non-normative female-presenting person. Her body type is very male. She wears her hair very male. She dresses very male. And that idea is woven throughout this whole concept and this whole piece, masterwork. And what she is talking about is the power of stories, the power of selectively choosing your story. And and then she kind of breaks down some comedy insider baseball for us and talks about that punchlines need trauma because they need tension, and tension feeds trauma. So the way that jokes work is that the person creates tension in the room, and you feel really nervous and really uncomfortable, and then the punchline cuts the tension and you can all laugh. And what she tells you in this work is that she's no longer willing to cut your tension.
And especially for her, because she identifies as what she claims, as a person who exists within the margins. Because she is a, non-gender normative woman who identifies as a lesbian. She says, comedy is a lot about self-deprecating humor, but when you already exist in the margins, self-deprecation isn't humility, it's humiliation. And so that's a really important part of building the tension that she builds, is she is building tension off of self-deprecating, humiliating humor. And that's what she has decided she is no longer going to do, because it's harmful to her and it's harmful to other people that identify like her, which I thought was absolutely brilliant.
And what's really interesting is that for me, this juxtaposition is coming at the time that Netflix has chosen to release a show that is very body shaming called Insatiable. And it's really upsetting. And I'm not trying to say that dramatically. It was really upsetting to me as somebody whose body exists outside of traditional feminized beauty. And so there was a lot of this particular piece of work of Nanette that I really understood in a way that I've never certainly talked about in my role as the good doctor before, but for people who can't tell from my face, my body is a lot larger than a lot of other women's, and that is something that is very challenging for a lot of people in this world. I take up too much space. And that is a huge part of what Hana talks about, is the idea that people take up space, and in particularly the space in the cultural conversation that is given to reputations of powerful men that should be given to the stories of women. So that's all kind of a spoiler alert.
Yeah.
So I want to spoiler alert. So
6 minutes in.
Yeah. So I want to go back to this idea that she talks about. You learn from the part of the story that you focus on. And we talk a lot about this in a way, we just haven't used these words in our work.
Yeah.
Because we talk about the power of authenticity. And it's a really good gut check to realize the stories that you tell. We all do revisionist history about our lives. We all tell stories about our childhood that aren't fully true.
Or we tell them to be illustrative, which is what a comedian is doing. We tell them for a purpose, and then we don't tell the complete story. Yeah,
we don't tell the whole story.
Or we stop it at certain points until we get to the point that we want to illustrate, or the point that we want to make about ourselves, or about whatever story we're telling.
Absolutely. And the point that she makes that I think is very instructive to people in public spaces especially, is that the story you tell over and over and over again calcifies your history in a way that may or may not be accurate. So you may be performing vulnerability, but you're really not, because you've calcified it at a place that is comfortable. And this is a really good juxtaposition of the conversation I have about bounded vulnerability. Like, where I say there are pieces of you that the public doesn't get. And so you can tell a really painful story up to a point and then not give your whole self over to the general public. But if you are not telling yourself the full story, then you are missing what you're supposed to learn from it.
Yes.
Because not only do we learn from the stories that we hear from others, we learn from the stories we tell ourselves. And that's a gut punch, I would hope, to everyone, because we all do it. We all learn to solidify our identities based on the stories we tell ourselves. And the stories that we tell ourselves are very rarely accurate.
And the part of the story that we focus on when we're 20 and telling the story might not be the most beneficial part of the story for us, or the healthiest part of the story for us and our personal growth, or our understanding of vulnerability, or our understanding of our personal development, as it is in your 30s or in your 40s. So the other thing she brings out really early on is that she is revisiting this.
Yeah.
And she's realizing that when she started being a comedian 10 years ago, she calcified herself in these traumatic moments that she used for tension. And she's now revisiting that and deciding, you know what, this isn't so healthy anymore. And I think that's a really important part of it. And we both, as academics, talk a lot about kind of reflexivity and looking back at ourselves. And that was another key part of her narrative, was that even in the stories that you tell, sometimes you have to stop and take a look at them and be like, is this still serving me? Is this still serving others in the best way? Or should I focus on a different part of the story now?
Yeah. Or that in terms of comedy, which a lot of us try to be funny even if we're not comedians, you freeze at the part where the tension is resolved in a way that appeals to the person that's listening to you. Instead of perhaps allowing the tension to sit for a lot longer, because life doesn't resolve like a punchline.
Yeah. And tension makes people uncomfortable. But it can also be constructive.
Yeah.
Tension.
Yeah.
Because it allows you to sit with things and process things, rather than just making us all feel better by, cracking a joke, by giving us the punchline and letting us all, that moment, that tension passed.
And this is the same as when something really traumatic happens in your life, that people feel the need to tell you really big platitudes, like everything happens for a reason, or God has a plan, or something really, really, that's another tension cutter. Whereas whenever I talk about sitting in trauma with people, I say, just sit in that trauma, sit in that awfulness, sit in that tension. This is another really important piece of, like, when something really traumatic happens in someone's life, that just like in comedy that we want to cut the tension, we also want to cut the tension in human to human conversation. And what we really should do instead is learn to sit in tension. and understand that you don't have to exit a conversation feeling comfortable.
Yeah.
Like I was actually, just before we started having this conversation, was talking to a friend of mine who is experiencing infertility. And I actually have many, many friends who have experienced infertility. And I think most women in their 30s certainly do as well.
Mm-hmm.
And she was saying that she has, there's a potential acquaintance who wants to have a phone call soon. And she thinks she's going to be told that acquaintance is pregnant. Mm. And she knows that the acquaintance wants her to like give her permission to be joyful. And my friend's kind of like, you know what? I just want to say that I just kind of want to tell her that I'm not. Mm-hmm. I'm happy for her, but I'm still going to sit over here in pain. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to perform joy for her because of that. And it made me really think of what Hana was unpacking here. Yeah. It's not the responsibility of other people sometimes. It's not our responsibility to cut the tension for other people.
Yeah.
As much as we pretend it is. Mm-hmm. And this is a very gendered conversation, clearly, and we'll get to that in a minute. And because the way that she transitions between this kind of generic conversation about your personal story into a much more specific conversation is, and you're not going to believe this, through the lens of art history.
You guys, I was so excited.
Take it away. Renaissance art historian, Dr. Hinson.
Oh, I thank you. I thank you. This is obviously the most I've ever seen anyone who's not an art historian talk about art history.
Including at art museums we go to.
Ever. So the premise of the show, and this isn't spoiling anything because it's pretty well out there, is that she decides she's going to quit comedy, because she doesn't want to do this type of humor anymore. And so she jokingly says, well, what am I going to fall back on? She goes, 15 years ago, I got an art history degree, which is worthless. But she uses art history brilliantly to talk about, and what she said again was that we learn from the part of the story that we focus on. So she starts by talking about one of her experiences with a person who viewed her show and came up afterwards to tell her that she shouldn't be taking antidepressant medication because the myth of the creative artist, which we talk about a lot in art history, is that, in order to be creative, you kind of have to be a little crazy to be good at it. And we've sold this myth through telling stories like Vincent van Gogh. Yes, it's Van Gogh. It's Van Gogh, but it's actually Van Gogh because it's Dutch. I think we can now start to be accurate in how the name is pronounced, even though I called him Van Gogh for probably 30 years of my life. So Vincent,
I called him Van Gogh. I called him Van Gogh until the episode of Doctor Who where he shows up.
Right. Such a good episode.
Great episode.
So she utilizes Van Gogh's story because this man tells her, if Van Gogh wasn't crazy, we wouldn't have the sunflowers. And she uses her art history degree because he was actually treated, medicated, self-medicated with alcohol, with drugs, absinthe, but also sought several times in his life the help of medical professionals.
Psychiatric medical professionals.
Starry Night was in fact painted while he was in an asylum, little known fact, which he checked himself into. This was not one of those like his family intervened.
No.
But the story that we tell of Van Gogh, we tell in like looking back at him now, that he was this tortured artist who was misunderstood.
No.
Suffering for his art, and only after his death did he find fame.
I mean, he was tortured, but not by his art, by his own brain.
No, and he was certainly doing different things for the time that he was painting, but not so different that,
she says there's nobody who's ahead of their time because everybody is of their time. It's not physically impossible to be ahead of your time.
Unless you're a premature baby.
And then you catch up. And so she makes the point that he is a post-impressionist artist painting
at the height
of post-impressionism.
Yes. But the way we tell his story is that he is this exceptional narrative, because that's how we tell the stories of very famous male artists. We don't really talk about female artists, spoiler alert. Even the ones that we do are kind of the exceptional ones, because that is how we framed a global discourse about artists and creative people. And so she uses Van Gogh in that way to talk about how our perceptions of masculinity, of mental illness, are controlled by these larger narratives, and that these narratives are told by men.
And so instead of his torturedness, who are the two people responsible for why we know who Van Gogh is?
This is one of my favorite parts of the story. And she alludes to this, but she forgets to mention somebody. That's not meant as a critique, but because I'm sure she was in a very traumatic part of her story, and a very difficult thing to do. So she says at the end, we're going to go to the end really quickly. She says, the reason we have Vincent van Gogh's work, any of it, is because his brother loved him. And the story that we aren't told in like larger art history narratives, unless you really, really dig deep into Van Gogh, which I did, is that he wrote letters to his brother every day, 10, sometimes multiple letters a day, talking about his process, talking about everything. And his brother saved those letters. His brother very tragically died 6 months after Van Gogh injured himself, or maybe was killed. We don't really know what happened to him, but the common trope is that he committed suicide. We're not entirely sure that's what happened. Another spoiler alert. And his wife, Theo's wife, Joanna, saved all of the letters, collected all of them, and published them. So that is how we know who Vincent van Gogh was as a person and his relationship with his brother. But he had somebody who loved him.
He had his people.
He had his people. He had his tribe. And that's how we know anything of who he was. Because he did only sell one painting in his lifetime.
Because he was really bad at networking.
The truth is, he was socially awkward and potentially on the spectrum, and suffering from a variety of mental illnesses and instabilities that made him really not a great networker.
And just like now, the means of distribution are controlled by money and power.
It's power, Art is all about power. The history of art is all about men who were in power and how they use that power to influence history and sell pieces of art.
It's the same with art now. Publishing, television, all of it. Why do we have all this crap that CBS constantly produces? Because those are the stories Les Moonves wanted to tell. We have a lack of diverse people in publishing houses, published by the big five publishing houses, because there are not diverse voices on the staff to advocate for them in a specific way, or there are not voices on the staff that are advocating for them. We don't talk about, we malign romance because the New York Times decided that women-centric stories aren't important. It's these kind of, it's this.
It is this. And she transitions to yet another famous artist in order to talk a little bit more about the toxic, insidious, sexist relationship between having all of these men in positions of power. And she talks about Picasso. And we've been, we should say, together to both of their national museums. So the Vincent van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam and the Pablo Picasso Museum in Barcelona. The Vincent van Gogh Museum was delightful.
Lovely experience. Really, really loved it. I am very ill-educated when it comes to art, which she has helped me break in that I get to love what I love now, which I also
have
really
given
enjoy.
her permission to actually like things on her own merit without any art historical knowledge, which is a permission that I now bequeath to all of you as well.
It's really cool.
If you don't like it and it doesn't speak to you,
it's not good.
You don't have to care about it.
No.
I promise you. If you don't like Van Gogh, you don't have to go spend $18 to go see an exhibition because,
at MoMA.
Because somebody told you he's important.
No. But at the same time, find yourself an art historical buddy, because if you really like some of this stuff and you want to know more of why they painted the way they painted or what the context of the paintings are,
it's cool.
Yeah, like Night's Watch at the Rijksmuseum by Rembrandt, I would have had no idea why. I knew I liked it, but I wanted to know more, and that's why you need an art historian buddy. But yeah, so I was non-art historian, was trying to be like really good best friend, and was like, we have to go see Picasso because I had no idea she hates it. I don't like Picasso. And guys, can't lie, after that museum, I didn't like him that much. And then Hannah tells me this story. And he can do one from beyond the grave.
He's not a good dude. And I mean, I don't like Picasso aesthetically.
I mean, Guernica was powerful, but I only think Guernica was powerful because my art history teacher told me that Guernica was powerful.
And that's the myth of art history. Like, I don't know how much any of us actually think this stuff is good, or we've just been told to be a smart person, we have to think it's good.
Yeah.
And we internalize that. Mm-hmm. So you have to start real early with young people to get them to think for themselves, because art history is not about thinking for yourself. Trust me, I spent 10 years in that discipline, and you're just supposed to regurgitate what older, usually white men tell you should think about art. That's why I'm not actually a practicing art historian, one of many reasons.
She's just a pragmatic one.
But what she tells us about Picasso, right? You know, yes, innovative, sure. Cubism, great. Changed the face of art, 100%. Gave us permission, as many other artists did, including women artists, to think beyond one perspective in art. But he was not a kind person. He was a misogynist.
He was a pedophile?
He was a pedophile. He didn't see a problem with sleeping with underage women and girls.
And getting them pregnant.
At all. And the quote she says, you know, he says, I burn every woman, something along those lines. I wrote down the part that matters. After I leave, I burn every woman. Destroy the woman and you destroy the past she represents.
Guys, sit with that for a minute. That another human being said that about an entire gender, and not like, I burn all Nazis. Like, I burn all people who are awful to me. No. All women.
Destroy the women and you destroy the past they represent. And he is one of our, collectively, Western civilization, most
heroes.
Lauded, romanticized for his virility, for his passion, potentially impactful artist.
Guys, he's gross. He's really, really gross.
He was a gross misogynist old dude who liked to sleep with young girls and then treat them horribly afterwards.
I say no. I'm now done.
So the gift of Picasso is, yes, that we can change perspectives, but as Hannah rightly points out, and that we should consider multiple perspectives. He did give us that with Cubism, but so did all the other Cubist artists as well. We just don't talk about them.
And
talk about Picasso.
Later on next year, spoiler alert for Abbey Research fans, we will be talking a whole lot more about the unsung heroes of art, as Dr. Hinson is going to teach us about people who are trailblazers whose names we don't know. Yes. So get excited. I'm excited because I love learning about things I don't know, and she knows a lot of things. Yes. But one of the things that Picasso, the hinge that she turns with Picasso, that Hannah, not Aaron, that Hannah turns with Picasso, is that we as a people, as a Western civilization, are very happy to trade the health and safety of women and children for the reputation of men. And she name checks Picasso, Roman Polanski, Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, Pablo Picasso, and we all could add how many? I mean, she adds Donald Trump to that because certainly that's what that's what the Access Hollywood tape tells us.
Yeah.
Is that anyone who promoted him from NBC, putting him on The Apprentice onwards, traded the safety of women
for his
reputation
and his power. And that's the thing that she uses the story of one of his mistresses, Picasso's mistresses, Marie-Therese Walter, who was 17 when they met and when they slept together, so she was underage, to talk about this point, to make this point. And she says, we discounted her story, Marie-Therese's story, because we never thought that she could have more value than Picasso. So I want you to sit with that and think about the reputation of men and the power of men and that we have given them in society, and the power to tell stories and how we tell stories, because we could not conceive that this 17-year-old woman could reach in her life more value than the 42-year-old Pablo Picasso.
He also talked about how she was in her prime.
When she was
17. I want to be very, very clear. I am yet in my prime, and I am 34.
Somebody please tell me when I get to my prime, because I'm not there yet. But it's not when I'm 17. It wasn't when I was 17.
Oh no. What I was at 17 was very vulnerable. What I was at 17 was would have been completely willing to do whatever a 42-year-old man who told me he loved me said.
Yeah, and who was that powerful?
Influential. And I want to be very, very clear. We were both raised in loving homes with parents who adored us and were wonderful to us. We won the lottery on childhoods, and both of us still would have gone with Picasso, because that is how 17-year-old girls work. Like, that's how they work. And so I should talk about, Hana talks about that anger isn't motivating. And I like quibble a little bit with her on that, because I think that righteous anger can be very motivating. And so she gives us her righteous anger through this. And at one point screams like, you're never going to come for me because I am in my prime now. You were going to come for me when I was 17 and when I was 19 and when I was 22, because that's when we destroy women.
Yep.
Because that's when they're vulnerable. They're not in their prime. We tell the myth that they're in their prime then, because that's when they're destroyable. And I've now watched this thing, by the way, 3 times. So on this particular viewing, this most recent that happened today for both of us, the thing that stuck out to me the most is that the reputations of these predators are fed by vulnerable children. They're fed by vulnerable children. We have lived in multiple countries, and there are narratives of these men in every country.
Every single one.
There are narratives of these men throughout history.
Throughout time.
In Memoriam. We sacrifice the dignity and worth of women and children on the altar of male reputations. And she talks about the social responsibility of story in this. She talks about if the comedians had done their job when Monica Lewinsky was happening and had skewered President Clinton instead of Monica Lewinsky, the world would be different, that their responsibility was to have skewered him and not her. And we sat and talked a little bit about our responsibility as storytellers, because fundamentally that's what we are. And fundamentally, I'll be honest, I think all humans are storytellers. It's how we communicate. It's how we bond.
It's how we connect with people.
Is storytelling. And she does a kind of a vignette that I'm not going to touch about being a broken person and rebuilding yourself, because that's a very, very personal piece for not only us, but I think for most people that have watched this work of art. She says things, there's nothing stronger than a broken woman who has rebuilt herself. I agree with that. And any strength, I was thinking a lot when she talked about that, for instance, is about my grandma who passed a couple months ago. And none of you knew my grandmother. None of you knew her story. But as we talked about, she was widowed twice. She was born in the middle, born right before the Great Depression, widowed twice, raised 3 girls essentially on her own, was a total badass, and died in her sleep at 98. And she rebuilt herself many, many times. Nothing dramatically tragic happened to my grandma, except sit there again in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She was a single mom.
Yeah.
And nothing, I've never met a stronger person than my grandma ever, except maybe my mother, who was raised by my grandmother. So it works.
There's a theme.
It works.
Yeah.
But it's all these quiet, incredible women who have just rebuilt themselves. And so I don't want to unpack that a little bit more. What I would like to go back to is this idea that she touched on with Van Gogh, about that we know him because somebody loved him.
Yes.
And that stories are our cure.
Yes. Not laughter necessarily, which is the myth, but that stories. And because stories build human connections and foster our innate sense of humanness with each other. So we recognize bits of our story in other people, always. And I mean, we recognize, Dr. Donnelly talked about, and I talked about, bits of ourselves in Hana's story, even though it's very much Hana's story.
Oh, 100%. But
recognizing that innate humanity is what builds empathy and what builds compassion and understanding and changes our perspective and brings in a new perspective. And that's the strength. That's the cure that stories have.
Which means that we have to be very responsible with them. It means that we have to be careful about the stories we're paying attention to and the stories that we're propagating. It means that we have to be careful to make sure that we're listening to stories well. This has been a conversation that we've been involved in as academics forever, because we talk a lot about how we've essentially made our living on the backs of people's lives, because they have been gracious enough to share their pain with us in both of our particular circumstances, or just open up their tables and feed us and tell us stories.
Tell us their stories, yeah.
And how do we be responsible with that? And how do we understand without condoning? How do we understand context without condoning actions or beliefs or behaviors or things like that? So we're going to wrap up this video by encouraging you to seek out stories that don't make sense to you on the surface.
Stories that challenge your perspective or your worldview or your understanding of a particular topic or identity or individual or whatever.
And we understand that starting that journey can feel very shaming, and you can feel very isolated and have no idea how to start. So get in touch with us, and we'd love to help you start.
We have a list of books.
We have lists of books and movies and documentaries, but even more importantly, we'd love to point you to people who have taught us the same thing. Mm-hmm. This is one of the ways in which Twitter is actually kind of helpful. Mm-hmm. It's mostly a dumpster fire, but occasionally it's helpful in listening to some other voices.
Sometimes it's for jokes.
Sometimes it's for jokes, but sometimes it's for great thinkers. For instance, if you're a podcast person and you are also white, I would really encourage you to listen to NPR's Code Switch, because it's really going to open up some understandings of a world that you've never inhabited in this America. If you are a male, I would really encourage you to listen to the Standard Issue podcast, which is run by a whole bunch of really smart ladies talking about what it's like to be a really smart lady in a society that often doesn't love really smart ladies.
Nope.
Seek out the real stories of your heroes and make sure they deserve to be your heroes.
And give them the space to tell their stories, and then give those stories the space to be listened to in other places and to be heard.
And be messy. I mean, for me, I'm out on Picasso now because he made a couple choices.
Yeah, I'm
out.
Not a fan.
There are other people that I really, really love that I've heard really horrible things about, but then I've watched how they've redeemed it, and I've been like, you know what? I can still walk with that person. I can still enjoy that art because of their story, or I can still be in a relationship with this person because of this. And there's been other times where I've heard stories and I'm like,
now we're done.
Now we need to go.
Yeah.
And that's okay too. Mm-hmm. The story that Hana is trying to tell is the power of stories. And we wanted to affirm that.
And chat a little bit about it.
And we would love to continue this conversation. So as always, comment below. Yeah. If you've got stuff to say that is a little too personal for public forays, you know how to get in touch with us. We'll put up a link to our clarity calls, which are free and just chats. And you can grab both of us and we'll talk through these things that we've learned and how to help you on your journey towards embracing all of the ugly bits of your story. Mm-hmm. And so you don't calcify them into truths that they're not.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And I'm Dr. Hinson.
And we're the good doctors of Abbey Research, wishing you fully fledged stories and the freedom to tell them as messy as they are. Bye.
Bye.